Then along came the Clayton Act, 20 or 30 years after. I don't get too hung up on the dates, but 20 or 30 years, say, after the Sherman Act, to really be a little bit more proactive about mergers and acquisitions and the creation of monopolies and restraint of trade. And what I mean by that, as we go through, you're going to see this. The first slide looks a lot more makes the Clayton Act look a lot like the Sherman Act, that we outlaw certain things, right? The practices that substantially lessen competition or create a monopoly. But it did ease the burden of proof, so think more civil, versus criminal. It does say that the Justice Department can intervene and issue some court injunctions. And think about these, and think about the Clayton Act as being more preemptive, okay? Whereas the Sherman Act didn't have any teeth in it that would have, possibly stopped mergers and acquisitions from happening, but rather after the fact might come in and argue that the result of the merger was a restraint of trade. The Clayton Act is more preemptive and says that we can come in and the Justice Department can issue injunctions, to maybe stop mergers and acquisitions, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, triple damages, costs, and fees are similar also to the Sherman Act. The Clayton Act also set up, we'll get to that, I'm sure, in a slide or two, but set up the FTC, or the Federal Trade Commission. So the Robinson-Patman Amendment to the Clayton Act said it disallowed, or it said that there can't be quantity purchasing advantages. And again, it's a restraint of trade issue that says, manufacturers can't favor maybe large companies in particular, is what they were worried about, with much lower prices that restrained trade. There are some exceptions to those things, which we talk about down here. That kind of is how Walmart probably gets away, because Walmart certainly negotiates for some lower prices, probably do things like this, a cost justification, right? If Walmart's buying a gazillion of something, it's a little less expensive for the manufacturer to deliver it, do whatever the case may be, okay? And so they may in fact get a little bit of a cost, but they can't do it, again, in restraint of trade. It involves sale of goods, and it's a predatory pricing issue, things that we've kind of already discussed about, also in relation to the Sherman Act. So exceptions, of course, good faith transactions, that could be almost anything, right? But good faith transactions that aren't in restraint of trade, and that could be timing issues, things like that might come into effect. And also meeting of competition would be one, or changing conditions. Again, good faith transactions, changing conditions. So, you're a manufacturer and your price of product goes down, your raw materials goes down 30%. So 2 months after you just sold a bunch of stuff to one small competitor, maybe you can lower the price to a bigger competitor. That's fine. Okay. Tying contracts. And reciprocal dealings are kind of similar things, maybe, but a tying contract would be here. If you buy this, you must buy, this other product from us. Forcing companies maybe to do that, full line forcing they call it. So, if a manufacturer makes a line of products here, if you buy the top of the line, you also must buy middle of the line and bottom of the line, et cetera, right? Reciprocal dealing is, here, if we sell to you, then, or if we buy from you, then you must buy from us, might be an example of reciprocal dealing, right? And again, companies do that all the time, buy and sell from each other. And so there's no harm in that necessarily, as long as it does not restrain trade. Okay. Exclusive dealing, setting territories, doing those types of things we've kind of talked about with the Sherman Act. And a requirements contract, again, just something that might be in a contract that restrains trade, has certain requirements in it that might do just that, would be illegal. So enforcement, again, we go back to the Sherman Act, and enforcement was through the Department of Justice. Again, it was kind of an after-the-fact thing, whereas the enforcement for the Clayton Act set up the Federal Trade Commission. It's preemptive. They review now mergers. I talked about Broadcom, Qualcomm taking place right now, potentially taking place. That will be reviewed for sure, okay, because it's it's a lot of money. It may create monopoly, on and on. So it's going to be reviewed by the Federal Trade Commission prior to it happening, okay. We had in banking, too, they had similar, we were regulated by the FDIC and the Federal Reserve, and so they had similar procedures when banks wanted to merge, okay, wanted to make sure that the trade wasn't restrained, et cetera, et cetera. So types of mergers, we can have market extension, right, where we are, that would be like if, I was going to say if Apple bought Qualcomm, because Qualcomm makes a lot of the gadgets or what am I trying to say, the little chips, for their phones and whatnot. Okay, that would be kind of a market extension, a geographic extension, just covering different areas, right? Moving around the world, other parts of the U.S. One of the mergers that took place was it Tim Hortons and I can't remember who Tim Hortons went in with. Okay, that almost both in that case. You had an expansion of product offering because you had donuts. I think it was combining. It might have been like Burger King or something, right? So you had a combination then of these two different fast food offerings. Plus, you had one in Canada, one in the U.S. So some of these mergers could almost be both, right? Again, the Federal Trade Commission, they look at things ahead of time. Okay. Look for things that might create unfair competition. In enforcement, right? If the conduct is going to injure consumers, we might put a stop to it, or even after the fact, if it does, okay, we can put a stop to it. Same things with, they have the same types of legal abilities as other agencies would have. In other words, they can do injunctions, they can do consent decrees, they can do cease and desist orders, etc. Okay? Things that might offend public policy or violate public policy, certainly, or conduct that's oppressive. Seems pretty obvious. Their primary function, again, versus the Sherman Act, is going to be prevention. I think your question, DirecTV and the Dish, which have not been allowed to merge, and they had proposed that a couple of years ago, and they've backed away from that because they got some grief. I don't think there was ever an official ruling, but they were running into some roadblocks going through the Federal Trade Commission, and so they just decided to not pursue it. Okay. On the other hand, you had Sirius and XM that were allowed to. And I wonder if Direct and Dish were to propose a merger again, and they might, okay, because the competitive landscape's really changing in that space, and their argument would be the same as Sirius and XM, and that is that the offerings and the ability for people to obtain entertainment has completely changed. Most millennials are cord cutters, meaning that they don't have traditional TV. Okay, they're not hooked into a cable system. They don't have a Dish or Direct or any of those things, right? They get a lot of their media content right through. Instead, they get that through maybe the internet. Okay, and so their argument might be a little stronger now if they did want to join forces. And like I said, who knows? They very well could. So that's it for Chapter 16. Relatively short chapter. So thanks, and we will talk to you about Chapter 17 coming up soon.